Why, hello there.
Hello.
I hear you have a question for me.
I do have a question for you. So I was talking to somebody at the gym about Dr. Mike's, one of his newer videos about reps in reserve for hypertrophy. We all know Dr. Mike is in favor of not training to absolute failure all the time for hypertrophy. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on training with reps in reserve for hypertrophy, as well as how that applies to strength training.
That's a good question. And it's a very good question. I think a lot of people struggle to make sense of that because they'll hear this talking point from Mike, probably being the most prevalent one, Dr. Mike, saying that, hey, rather than do a few less sets with 0 reps in reserve, from a hypertrophy training standpoint, we're probably better served doing a few extra sets and leaving a little bit in the tank on each one. So that is to say, leaving a little bit in reserve so that we can create our difficulty by doing a greater number of sets. All kind of based off of this premise that the final reps of a set as we approach failure are more fatiguing than they are stimulative. So we're better off accumulating a greater number of sets at 2 to 3 RIR. A lot of people will struggle to kind of make sense of finding a balance between this and also the importance of training reps close to failure is a skill. And especially for a power lifter, for a weightlifter, for a strongman, the ability to execute reps at a high level of difficulty and at a low proximity to failure is a skill that we need to challenge. So how do we kind of strike a difference between these two? And the first talking point that I think we could probably touch on a little bit is, yes, we probably have reason to believe that if hypertrophy is the sole goal, we are going to probably be a little bit better off accumulating a few more sets with a little bit in reserve than doing a few less sets, but with that close proximity to failure. Yes, we probably have some evidence to support that, but we also have a reasonable bit of evidence to suggest that the average person is woefully bad at accurately gauging their reps in reserve. So for pure hypertrophy training purposes, I personally like using a mix of the two, right? Oftentimes, anytime you have a question and you've got 2 extreme answers on either side, the practical answer is probably found somewhere in the middle. So I like accumulating a few sub-maximal sets and then using the final set, taking that to mechanical failure as a bit of an audit to see how accurate I actually was on those initial sets. I'm gonna go all out. Obviously, I'm gonna be disciplined. I'm not gonna let my form deviate in order to chase numbers, but I'm going to check where mechanical failure was, and that's gonna inform me whether I was kind of sandbagging those original sets. We can kind of get a little bit of the best of both worlds with this approach while also addressing the accuracy of our reps in reserve, kind of like what we feel it is. So that's kind of my approach for hypertrophy. Now, how do we make sense of this for strength training? Well, the nice thing is gauging RIR or RPE, most people are bad at it, but like anything else, it's a skill. And the primary way we're gonna get better at any skill is to do it, right? So just to say, oh, well, people are bad at gauging RIR, we're screwed. That's probably not smart, right? People will, I start working with someone, they're like, oh, I've never used RPE, I'm bad with it. That's fine. The only way to get better at it is to do it. So don't worry, we're just gonna try to be more and more accurate with our RPEs over time so we can get better at the skill of gauging reps in reserve, especially on motions that we're going to be doing all the time. So whether we're a weightlifter, a powerlifter, or a strongman, we're gonna have some motions that we're doing on a regular basis. Over time, we should actually be able to calibrate our feel for the reps in reserve pretty well. Now, some accessories that we do infrequently, we might not actually have that well calibrated. You know, you might get to the point where on your back squat, on your front squat, on your overhead press, on your bench press, on your deadlift, we have a pretty accurate feel for reps in reserve, but we go hop on a lateral raise. And it's like, really, are we that confident that was 3 RIR, not 5? You couldn't have done 5 more strict reps if I put a gun to your head? In which case we can kind of bifurcate, right? So on smaller accessories where there's less of a systemic fatigue to worry about, we can probably favor towards a little bit more mechanical failure type work, and we can kind of use that blended approach we talked about earlier. But on the main lifts, I do like early in a training cycle when we're in a hypertrophy phase, let's say we're working in the 6 to 10 rep range, I really do like that idea of, hey, instead of, let's say you got a squat workout, doing 2 all-out sets of 6 to 10. Where we just we empty the tank, we go all out, and we do these hard sets. That's gonna be XYZ stimulus, or we leave a little bit of reps in reserve and we do 4 or 5 sets at RPE 7, so leaving about 3 in the tank. I strongly favor towards, for the hypertrophy phase for a strength athlete, accumulating more of those submaximal sets. Because we have reason to believe that the hypertrophy outcome is probably going to be a little bit better. B, because it's going to probably lead to similar, if not maybe a little bit less systemic fatigue, so we can do this again a little bit sooner. And then 3, we're going to be drilling good motor patterns, because the habits we establish early in a training cycle, as the weights get heavier, it's only going to get worse. So we want to start from some pristine form. And training with 3RIR lets us establish this baseline of hopefully all-time new personal best technique. That way, when things get heavier and maybe a little bit of breakdown happens, we have wiggle room. Maybe there's a little breakdown, but it's still very much within our comfort range. The problem is when we do these all-out sets of 10, while they do work, and while there is some benefit to practicing doing hard reps, is we're usually going to over-accumulate fatigue a little bit too early in the training cycle. And also, we're going to be drilling some pretty crap reps if we're taking our set of 10 to mechanical failure. The latter couple of reps there are probably going to be practicing something that's not looking so good. And as things get heavier and heavier and we push further and further, it's only going to get worse from there. So establishing this pristine baseline to begin the training cycle, I find to be very helpful. And also, we can kind of follow this ideological, hypothetical optimal of accumulating a few more sets. So it's kind of a best of both worlds scenario. And then when we progress into a strength or a peaking type phase, that's when the proximity to failure is going to decrease. We're going to be practicing doing these difficult reps. So our number of sets will come down. And as our number of sets comes down, to keep the workouts difficult, we'll probably need to increase the RPE. So, when I'm looking at you're fine. You can put the weight down louder than that. When you're looking at a hypertrophy phase, we're usually looking about accumulating as much volume as we can in the 60 to 75% range. My main goal is hitting these big volume PRs at these different weights. So, this is the most volume I've built at 2 plates with good form. This is the most volume I've built at 235, 245. And that's kind of the gauge for a successful hypertrophy phase in my mind, is building up these large quantities of volume at markers with this good high rep quality. Then when we transition to a little more of a strength phase, we're not necessarily gauging our success as much off of the total volume accumulated as load. More we're looking for rep. I would say strength phase, I'm looking for a little bit more of the rep PR. So hypertrophy phase, 60 to 75%. Yeah, stop sitting on me, buddy. 60 to 75% or 6 to 12 reps. Accumulating a lot of volume. Strength phase, the proximity to failure is going to decrease, so the RPE is going to go up, and we're looking more for rep PRs. Rep PRs in the 4 to 6 rep range, usually working in the 70 to 85% range. So the amount of sets we're doing is coming down. We're going to be doing a more difficult set on average, and then that same trend continues when we move into more of a peaking style phase. The number of sets we're handling is going to be at its lowest, and the RPEs are going to be at their highest. So I would say, how do we contextualize that as a strength athlete? We view it as something that scales across the training cycle. So the RPE is going to be low and the number of working sets is going to be high, and those kind of crisscross halfway through the block. In a strength phase, we kind of have a middle ground of doing a medium amount of sets at a medium RPE, and then we're doing a few sets at a very high RPE, presumably in a lower rep range when we're more in a peaking phase. But the same thing could apply for higher reps.
Examples of what RPEs you use?
I usually will like to have athletes accumulate most of their volume in the 6 to 8 RPE range. So 2 to 4 reps in reserve for a hypertrophy range. Usually we're kind of centering around 2 reps in reserve for a strength phase, but it could be a set like RPE 7, RPE 9. So 1 to 3 reps in reserve for a strength phase. For the most part, there's going to be work where you're like, shit, on that set I hit a 10. That's fine, but that's kind of the center point for most people. And then usually, just like we talked about, hypertrophy rep range is 6 to 12, 4 to 6, 1 to 3. Well, the RPEs are kind of 6 to 7, 8 center point for the strength, and then usually we're looking at a lot of work around 9 for the peaking phase. That would be kind of the averages I work around, but that's kind of how I would personally make sense of all of that. And then the other thing that I feel is worth mentioning here is that the more advanced an athlete gets, they're going to be able to approach closer proximities to failure with minimal breakdown. So becoming better at lifting, one of the big things we can do is fail a rep without having much breakdown, right? Or hit an RPE 10 rep with minimal breakdown. That's a very difficult skill, and it takes a very long time to get to the point where greater and greater percentages don't lead to visible breakdown. There's always going to be breakdown. You as the advanced lifter are going to know, oh, I did this wrong, but the untrained eye isn't going to be able to spot the difference between your RPE 10 and your RPE 8 other than the bar speed, the more advanced you get. So some people might speculate that more advanced lifters need to lean into higher RPEs, and that's almost a badge of honor that they've earned, is maybe if you are more advanced and you can have a pristine looking hard set of 8, that might be something you lean into. A guy who used to train at my gym, who you guys might be familiar with, is Damian Pizzuti, one of the greatest squatters out there at about 200 pounds body weight. High bar, no belt, no sleeves, hit like 750. An amazing squatter. I picked his brain a lot, and he felt that the more advanced athletes get and the more damage they're able to do with a single set, the more their training needs to lean into intensity a little bit more and lean away from volume, because the greater the tonnage you can move in a single set, the less sets you're probably going to be able to handle. That's something I've kind of seen. So that's something worth mentioning, that's worth throwing out there, is the more advanced you get, and the ability to do very difficult sets with minimal breakdown kind of negates that early technique form note we talked about earlier. But those would be my thoughts.
Good video.